Welcome to Everything Ethics, the weekly show where any ethics topic is on the table and all are welcome to join in. And today I have a very special guest. Charles Morgan, a good friend of mine, is in studio at the world famous Business Ethics Advisors headquarters in Roswell, Georgia. Well, Charles, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. Charles is the former General Counsel of Bellsouth and Chiquita Brands and the former Deputy Counsel of Kraft Foods. So he definitely comes from a position of authority when it comes to talking about the impact that ethics have on a major corporation. So we welcome Charles into the studio today.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for being here. So is there anything you'd like to add to your introduction?
No, I think only that I'd worked for several law firms in New York and Chicago and Houston, the Davis Polk and Mayer Brown and Fulbright law firms, where I had a varied practice, which included, among other things, compliance and litigation.
So definitely you see it from the major corporation, from the General Counsel suite too, which sometimes is probably a little bit different from the Chief Compliance Officer suite. I realize that in many corporations, the General Counsel is also the Chief Compliance Officer, or the Chief Compliance Officer reports to him. But you have real stories that you can share with us directly from there. So what is your experience as far as trying to build an ethical culture and the importance of it?
Well, Kevin, I think the most important thing about building an ethical culture is support from the top, because the whole organization will be watching to see if it has support from the top. And if you don't have that, the compliance officer and the general counsel are both going to be very frustrated. So the general counsel has to be really behind this as an initiative, and the CEO has to lead the way, and making sure that the other top managers, such as the chief financial officer, are all strongly backing it, and not just with words, but by their actions and their attitude and so forth. In other words, it's something that the senior leadership has to convince everyone else in the corporation that it's a serious thing, that we really believe in it, and that it's not a joke. It's not something that you have to do just to tick off the boxes. You've got to really internalize it. And I think that's what attracted me, Kevin, to what you're doing, because I thought it was, from what I've seen of your ethics and compliance activities, it's really quite different than other things I'd seen, which were really rule-based types of programs. And people can't be expected to remember lots and lots of rules. If you've got another job, marketing or communications, your job is really not to know specifically what the rules are, because that's why you have lawyers. But if you have a sense of what the rules are and you have a firm grounding about ethics, that's going to stand you in good stead and make you realize when you might be facing an ethical issue and you might need to talk to someone else.
That's right. That's values-based ethics training, I think, is very, very important. That's why I've gone down that route myself, because you really realize when you take a look at the instances of ethical lapses that people should have known better, just their own moral compass totally failed them. And I'm sure that it's very frustrating to other GCs like yourself that you spend all this time and effort developing an ethical and compliant culture, and then even seeing the very top guys get themselves sideways with ethics, as if those rules don't apply, to them. Everything from Wells Fargo and Volkswagen to down to Ford and Nike. There's all sorts of examples where the CEOs, very top officers, were actually the ones that were violating the ethics codes of the corporations. And that's got to be a really tough thing to see, don't you think?
I think it's very tough to see. In fact, it's also important that training in the ethics area is so important, because a lot of times it's not just second nature what's ethical or not in terms of business. It may or may not be instinctive to some people, but it's not always easy to spot. So you have to have your antenna finely tuned for ethical issues. And I'll give you an example of that. The whole really internal ethics and compliance function really started in the 60s and 70s. And I witnessed it. I was at a law firm in New York City, and it came about with the antitrust laws. And lots of companies were talking about things like prices with their competitors. So you can imagine a situation where margins were slim, competition was very intense, and an executive at one company or another might decide, hey, wouldn't it be better if we cooperated with each other on setting prices so we can both make money and we're not going to be killing each other's margins? Well, in one sense, from a pragmatic standpoint, that might be a smart business decision. On the other hand, it's totally illegal and a crime. It's called price fixing. And a lot of companies got in a lot of trouble for fixing prices, allocating markets, and doing other things, which to them made sense in a business matter, but not in a legal matter. And the net result of that was lots of companies paid hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. Executives went to jail. And guess what started after that? After the horse had gotten out of the barn, companies decided we have to have training in antitrust to let our executives more fully understand what the various rules are and the traps. And you can't always just, it's not as simple as whether you run a red light or not. And so that was really kind of the beginning of a lot of this, the whole compliance movement, if you will, was a result of that. And it was usually from companies, unfortunately, starting a compliance program, and this is all too common. They really don't believe in it until they've been hit by lightning. Oftentimes, an executive who hasn't been through something like this thinks it's sort of academic or whatever. But if you talk to anybody who's actually been through it, they will tell you that it's not like a bolt of lightning, in the sense that it can happen to you, and it happens a lot more frequently than a lot of executives may realize.
And that is particularly true with FCPA as well, because a lot of these executives are used to working in different cultures where bribery is perfectly acceptable and do not understand American laws and the business reasons for outlawing bribery. And so we've seen a lot of FCPA enforcement over the last, 20 years or so. And that has really hit companies hard and still hits companies hard. And we'll probably see a bunch more as a result of this pandemic as pipelines start getting really tight and people need to get business pushed through.
Well, that's really a very good point, Kevin. In fact, when the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was passed by Congress in 1967, there had already been, or 77, excuse me, there had already been a number of investigations, principally by the IRS. They had a program called the 11 Questions, and it had come to the attention of the IRS that companies were paying bribes and sometimes taking deductions for it and so forth. It became a very difficult issue because executives who were competing in some countries, for example, in Asia or the Far East or the Middle East, where paying bribes and so forth to government officials to get business was a very common occurrence and accepted occurrence. In fact, in some countries like Germany, bribes were even legally authorized to be deducted on your income taxes. So American businessmen had a lot of problems with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which they said would put them at a severe economic disadvantage. And every now and then you hear that same refrain, but the fact of the matter is Congress is not about to get rid of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Politically, no politician is going to be able to stand up and say, I'm in favor of bribery and let's get rid of the law. And so you have to adopt and adapt to an environment where maybe the mores and so forth are quite different. Let's assume you're trying to get an oil concession, and the king or the ruler of the country or one of his ministers is demanding a payment under the table. Now, you know that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prohibits any payments to a government official. And so then the question becomes, what do you do? Again, it's not a question of just that there's a red light there. It's a question of, well, how do we stay in legal compliance and so forth and stay ethical and hopefully still be able to compete? So that's a case where the ethical and compliance advisors have to work very closely with the management of the company to be able to forge a way through this sort of minefield to get the business and still stay out of legal trouble.
So what is your recommendation to companies today who need to make sure that all their employees are aware of all these different pitfalls? What would be your recommendation if you're sitting around with your other GC buddies and the subject came up and there was an open-ended discussion about it? What type of conversation do you think that would be involved in that?
Well, I think you have to be pragmatic and not preachy, not trying to convince people that this is the ultimate good or the ultimate bad. But ethics has a very practical side to it, in the sense, and what you try to do, Kevin, which really interests me and I think is great, is to teach people if an ethical issue does come up or a potential ethical issue appears on the horizon, there's an opportunity to do something about it, to go talk to somebody and get some help and that sort of thing. So not to be preachy, to be practical, advert to the headlines about companies that have gotten themselves in trouble. And you don't have to look very far in the newspapers to see about executives going to jail and companies paying huge fines. The thing you don't often read about is the huge legal fees that they pay to deal with that and the incredible disruption on a business. As I was referring, when I was in New York, we would be hired as a law firm to investigate starting in one country. And then we'd see that, well, that problem was coming up in other countries where the company, for example, was looking for oil concessions in a different country. And so the problem looked like it was not just local to one country. And at the end of the day, for one particular company I can recall, I led a team of 43 lawyers and 150 accountants. And we had to go all over the world as directed by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Justice Department to investigate this company top to bottom. And you still see that sort of thing happening when companies get in trouble. Volkswagen, for example, is one where they got in a lot of trouble for their emissions testing. And they've had a court-appointed monitor, a lawyer, who actually I know well, with a former U.S. attorney in Atlanta, whose job it was to follow everyone around in the company and make sure that they were doing the right thing. And if they weren't, there would be serious consequences. So just from a practical standpoint, look what's happening to other companies. If you have any doubt that this is real, as opposed to somebody just trying to cry wolf or making it seem worse than it is, just look at the facts.
I'm with you 100% on that. And thank you for bringing up what I do too. I call my ethics toolkit formula. So it's a process. So it's a solution, a global solution for companies. And the very first step is getting everybody in the company talking the same language. What are ethics and why are ethics important? And that's exactly what you were just talking about. So that everybody speaking the same language. And I do that with my keynotes and my workshops just to get everybody going. And then we have the actual more intense training, which is the online training. So you don't have to spend a lot of money bringing people together. People can do this at their desk as they have time. But that's my online values-based ethics training. And what's really key is bringing up all the leaders, so not only are they monitoring the people below them, but they can go ahead and assume higher positions and maintain a corporate culture. So I provide ethical leadership mentoring for those emerging next generational leaders, but it's certainly relevant for existing leaders at almost any level. And then just keeping ethics on the top of everybody's mind, I provide a weekly video. It's a short video on an ethics topic of the week that companies can distribute out as they see fit. But the whole purpose is to keep on reinforcing the whole ethical culture so that everybody is on the same wavelength as far as ethics goes. Maintain that sense of, this is what values-based ethical training is all about. This is what we are about as a company. And this is what we want to put forth to our customers and other stakeholders in the organization. So everybody knows that we're dealing with folks with integrity and honesty and in good faith. And we're not violating the law, and we're not violating, ethics. And this is all there for it. And then also I have a different program, which is more of a one-on-one type program. I call my Elite Access Executive Program, where it's a year-long program for more senior type of executives to be able to talk with peers and with myself and handle ethical challenges as they come up across the year. So we're trying to hit all aspects of ethical training so that everybody is, again, speaking the same language and is up to speed what it takes in order to develop that ethical culture.
Well, Kevin, I think that what you're doing is really, and what attracted me to it, what became interesting to me was how different it is from so many of the other ethics and compliance programs. I can remember going to my clients when I was practicing law in a law firm, and we would assemble 30, 40, 50, 60 of the executives in a conference room, and they would have to listen to me talk for an hour about this rule and that rule, this regulation and that regulation, and so forth. And, it was obvious to me that executives it wasn't something they were just eagerly looking forward to, because it wasn't interesting, it wasn't dry, it was dry, it was kind of a recitation of rules, and which gets boring very quickly. And I think with the pandemic, with COVID and technology now, your business has a really special opportunity to bring your teaching and your learnings to people on a technological basis, where someone can look at this at their desk, at the office, or at home at their dining room table, and take notes and really not be distracted by other things, and not having to travel to a different location to listen to some lawyer give an incantation of a bunch of rules. And I think it's particularly important, as you say, to have the point reinforced periodically. This is not something that people should be hearing about every 2 years. Not only a particular individual need reinforcement and the chance to ask questions, but also sometimes outside lawyers and consultants tend to forget that people are constantly moving around in corporations. There's constantly new people in positions. So if you gave a talk or somebody watched your program 6 months ago, let's say to the sales group of a particular company, the odds are very great that there'd be somebody out there working for the company who had since come to work for them, but after your initial presentation, where they hadn't yet heard your presentation. So they would be out there in the marketplace without the benefit of the knowledge and guidelines that you give. And that's just one more reason why it's important to have periodic reminders of the kind of points that you make.
Well, also my program is put on the company's LMS, Learning Management System, with strict accountability. So the company's leaders know exactly who watched the programs, who participated in the programs, and how long they actually watched it for. So there's some accountability there. And to the extent that somebody's coming up through the organization or just joined the company, then it's going to send out a red flag that, hey, this person needs this training as well, and they need to get up to speed. And these programs are meant to complement and supplement the company's existing ethics training programs. I'm not seeking to replace it. I'm just looking to complement and supplement it, because typically the existing programs are more rules-based, thou shalt and thou shalt not, and mine are more values-based, as I said before. And I try to keep it very interesting. You know, as you know, I spent 37 months in a federal prison for a white-collar crime. So I made the same mistakes that other executives have made and learned from those mistakes, and had an opportunity to talk to a lot of different executives and really keep up on why people make these unethical decisions and how devastating it can be to the company, to the family, financially, reputationally, just in every such way it could really ruin a life. And that's really where I think the sadness comes in on here, is how people don't realize that when they're walking that fine line between the light and the dark, how easy it is to slip over on the dark side. And it can literally ruin their lives, literally.
Well, I've seen that happen on quite a few occasions. And let me just emphasize that it's not simply that you're knowingly going through a red light, for example, if you're stopped at an intersection, because a lot of times executives will be put in a dilemma kind of situation. And I'll give you an example of that. One company that I worked for was a plant manager out in the Midwest, and they had strict production limits because they were discharging their waste into a navigable waterway. So the US EPA gave them limits of how much they could put into the river every month. Well, the company was successful and they kept increasing production. The plant manager asked corporate for capital expenditures to increase the capability of their wastewater treatment plant to handle the overloads of the increased production. Well, he was unsuccessful in convincing them to do it. Management said, well, you just find a way to do it. Well, the individual plant manager, he had been with this company many years. He had 2 kids in college, and he was beside himself. What am I going to do? They won't increase the limits like I've asked them to do. And if we go over the permit levels, we're going to get fined and a lot of trouble. So I'm going to get in a lot of trouble that way. So what should I do? Well, not having had the training, what he did not go to the company's compliance or ethics or legal people. He just decided on his own. And what did he do? He decided unilaterally that he would falsify the pollution discharge reports to the APA. And you could understand his reasons for doing that. He wanted to help the company. He wasn't profiting personally, but it was still a violation of federal law and federal criminal law. The net result was that the company took a very hard hit from their stock price because of this, and the individual plant manager was sentenced to federal prison for 5 years, even though he was trying to do the right thing. So it's a more sophisticated analysis that you are trying to make people sensitive to than just something that's super obvious.
That reminds me of a story from a guy that you and I both know who was a former GC for a major corporation. Now I believe he's the CEO of that company. And we were together once, and I asked him, what was it that kept him up at night? And his reply to me is very similar to what you're saying. What really keeps me up at night are those employees that are doing things that may be unethical or illegal, thinking they're actually benefiting the company. So that runs right into the exact same story that you're talking about. And I think that is something that people need to be fully aware of, is that committing an unethical or an illegal act is not beneficial to the company, is not beneficial to their career, because there's too high of a risk and you're not thinking about all the consequences of those decisions that you're making unilaterally. If you're willing to put the company into great financial and reputational harm, you need to corral the rest of the folks out there in the General Counsel's office, the compliance office, and make that decision as a company, not unilaterally.
Well, you can contrast, Kevin, the situation of in insider trading, where a particular executive knows some news that's not yet become public and trades in the stock market and makes a lot of money because he knew in advance that the stock was going to go up or down. And most executives know instinctively that that's illegal. But let's take something a little bit related. Let's assume that you're one of the financial executives at the company, and you know that the CEO and the board of directors have been putting a lot of pressure on the company to get the stock price moved up. And so therefore you want to make sure that the earnings look good. Well, a lot of people don't realize that there's a lot of ways to affect your quarterly earnings, and some are legal and some are not illegal. It has to do with timing of recognition of earnings and so forth. And so the rules are set forth for the accountants and the controllers, but we've seen from examples that sometimes the financial people are under so much pressure to keep the stock price up that they will not apply the appropriate rules. And again, you have a case like that as contrasted to insider trading, where the individual is not personally profiting from it, but they think that they're helping their career by doing what the higher ups want. And so that's why I think your program is so good for people to have those instincts developed and fine-tuned, and that they know what to do if they think they're getting close to a situation like that, where if it doesn't feel quite right, it doesn't just seem completely acceptable, that you know what to do about it, and not do as the plant manager I talked about and just try to make a decision on his own.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's just a lot of pitfalls out there, and we've seen a few here in Atlanta over the years. I remember Beezer, the chief accounting officer, ended up going to prison and he got caught totally unrelated to actually the earnings. The DOJ just stumbled across it when they were looking at the patent of loan files in North Carolina, and this guy was here. And he happened to delete some of his emails, even though there was an order saying that he shall not delete any emails, but he didn't think he was involved in or impacted by that DOJ order. And he certainly was. And when the FBI looked at the emails that were deleted, they focused in on him. And it turned out that he was actually reducing the company's earnings by taking higher reserves, what they call it smoothing of income, so that he can be able to take the reserves back out again. So in that instance, he thought he was probably being conservative in reducing their earnings, but the DOJ took the position that he was taking those in order to make future earnings look better, not and not necessarily the current earnings, but the future earnings, and that was smoothing of income. And he went to jail over that, and Beazer paid all sorts of fines in order to settle that particular lawsuit. So these things happen like all the time.
And one should remember that from a standpoint of a public company in particular, whose shares are traded on the public markets, every company has a board of directors, usually distinguished and accomplished business people. And they don't want to be embarrassed by having their friends know that they're serving on a board of directors, which got in a lot of trouble. So for example, imagine you were on the supervisory board at Volkswagen and you saw all this trouble. The board of directors, putting aside any potential legal liability that they may individually have, quite aside from that is the embarrassment factor and the fact that their stock holdings in the company may be affected and so forth. So there's a strong inclination among the corporate boards, which are really oversight bodies, to make sure that the CEO and the CFO and the company's top management are operating with a very ethical and compliance focused sort of culture. And if you don't have that, there will always be some executives who will want to take example of that, and that's what you have to watch out for.
Well, that's exactly true. I mean, none of this stuff happens in a vacuum, and people who are lower in the ranking in the company, they know what's going on with those executives. People talk, they have eyes, they can see, they know. And so they're going to take their cues from, their managers or their executives. So if the managers don't think it's that big of a deal, then why should the employees think it's all that big of a deal? There was an example, I think it was about a year ago, maybe a little bit more, maybe a year and a half ago, where Mark Zuckerberg's text became public during a particular lawsuit, and in one of those texts, he said he made the comment that ethics, we don't need to be ethical. There's nothing like that. Ethics are not that important. And it wasn't that long after that Facebook paid a $5 billion fine. So you imagine if your CEO and the founder of your company says that ethics are not important, you can imagine what the lower rung people are going to think that they can get away with. And, we see that happening, all the time.
You saw that from the beginning with Bill Gates, building computers initially in his garage and so forth, building a very successful business. And like a lot of entrepreneurs and successful business people, initially he very much poo-pooed this whole compliance and ethical notion, until the fact that the Department of Justice came after them big time, and they spent millions and millions and lots of heartaches by dealing with that. And so all you have to do is to ask some of these executives who've actually personally gone through this about the bad effects of it. It's so much more cost effective, and it makes sense as a business matter to hire a consultant, an advisor, to teach you about ethics and to have the culture strengthened. And not only that, but if you do get a wayward employee who does something wrong, the fact of your compliance program and your ethical culture program actually is a factor that is used by the Department of Justice and other law enforcement agencies in deciding how to treat you. So if you can show that you've got a great program, but somebody was sort of a lone wolf going off and doing the wrong thing, you're in a lot better shape than if you have no program, or really a weak one, or one that's just paper only that it doesn't really have the full support of the executive staff.
Look, I agree with you 100% on that. I think you take a look at Volkswagen again. Let's go back to Volkswagen. I mean, so far that diesel emissions scandal has costed $37.5 billion, and several executives have already gone to jail, and the chief executive officer is facing prison time in Germany. Mr. Winterkorn is facing prison time. I mean, that is just amazing. So when you're looking at $37.5 billion, so if you were just to spend, I don't know how much it would cost to bring an effective compliance, ethics and compliance program to 600,000 employees, but whatever it costs, you should be spending that money. I mean, I don't care what it costs. $37.5 billion is a lot of money. You don't think they can actually go through another scandal like that, do you? And I can think of a pharmaceutical company who's twice been hit up with $400 million in DOJ penalties to settle criminal allegations, and a third time for another $200 million. So it's $1 billion there that they've spent in penalties. I mean, this is real money, and real people's careers have been ruined because of these ethical lapses. So again, I mean, I realize, especially now in the time of COVID, where a lot of companies are thinking that the compliance function is a cost center, but you can really see it's actually a way to avoid these higher penalties. And it's just like, spend the money, I mean, it's spend the money, get your people trained, make sure that everybody is up to speed on all these different ethical issues, because it is just so, so important.
Well, you're exactly right, Kevin. And when I was general counsel at one big company, I saw that there were certain issues that would come up occasionally with this company. They were doing business all over the world with dealing with different cultures and legal systems. And I went to the CEO on several occasions and said, we need to establish a compliance committee made up of the senior management of the company to really take the lead on this. He thought about it for a couple of weeks, and he came into my office shortly thereafter and said, you remember that suggestion you made about a compliance committee? I said, yes. He said, well, I think it's a great idea. We're going to do it. I'm going to be the head of the committee, and you're going to be the chief compliance officer, in addition to the general counsel. And so I said, after a moment, I was like, well, we'll see. But we had monthly meetings, and at every monthly meeting, one or two different business units of this big multinational company would come in and make a presentation to the compliance committee and talk about what it is they had done and so forth, and answering questions for the different executives. And then the word of that really got around, hey, if you're the number one or number two at this particular division, you may be called in. We're not going to accuse you, but we're going to ask you to come in and tell us why you think what you're doing in the area of ethics and compliance is sufficient. And if it's not sufficient, it's not going to be good for your career.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing like keeping people accountable, that's for sure. And accountability is very, very important. You keep people accountable for their finances and the sales and so on and so forth. Why not also keep them accountable for how they're conducting their business, especially since the downside can be so steep to the company as a whole.
And Kevin, I wanted to add one thing to your point about cost effectiveness and so forth. If you look at how much companies have to pay, like Volkswagen and many others, when they get in trouble, that's really the tip of the iceberg. Because not only do you have fines and penalties, you have restrictions on doing business in various locations by different government units. You have the cost of outside counsel, which can be huge, and the disruption on business. And then you have, well, it's not always talked about, but is the loss in market capitalization of a company. If you're a big company and your stock goes down 5 points because of an investigation like this, that could be many more millions or billions of dollars. And that affects all the executives in the company that have shares of the company and profit sharing and other employee benefit plans. So it really has a much wider impact on the employee workforce than might appear at the first glance.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, also another thing that's been in the news quite a bit lately is the different sanction regimes that have been put in place by the Trump administration. And I know that companies are spending a lot of time and money to make sure that they're not doing business with bad actors out there. And I remember an interesting story that you once told me where one of your executives was kidnapped in Central America, and they were demanding ransom for that. Can you share that with us? Do you mind sharing that? Are you able to talk about that?
Yes. Well, this was in a dangerous part of Latin America, and my client was was a very well-known company in the region, and occasionally leftist guerrillas would come in and kidnap one of our executives and hold him for ransom. And then subsequently, the government of this particular country, Colombia, I can mention it, passed a law saying that it's illegal to pay ransom for kidnapping or anything else to any terrorist groups. On top of that, then the US government denominated some of these terrorist groups, like the FARC in Colombia, as terrorist organizations, meaning that US companies could not pay them money. So it was illegal under US law as well as the foreign law of Colombia. So then an individual gets kidnapped, and what happens? They kidnapper say they're going to kill him if you don't pay, but you know it's against the law to pay. So what do you do? I'll leave that out there as a question mark for you to think about how that finally came out, but it can be very, very ticklish and complicated. Not every case involves dealing with somebody's life, but I can remember getting a note from the kidnapper saying, you know, you either pay or we're going to send you his fingers one at a time. Mm-hmm. And so you really have to be able to think creatively and have good advice about how to deal with some of these situations that are real dilemmas that, as I said earlier, are often not for the personal financial profit of an executive. But there's a lot of other pressures that come to bear, whether it's the external pressures like I talked about, or pressures from a higher up to keep the earnings up, and so forth. Those pressures are everywhere. And if you're an executive with a family and kids in college and so forth, that can be very threatening, and it's very daunting to have to be alone in dealing with that. The good news is they can contact the ethics consultant or the ethics and compliance people internally, and they have a place to go and talk to. And so they don't have to take it all on their shoulders. They have now, they have an ally in how they're going to deal with the problem.
That is an amazing story. When you think about it, you know, a company, and we're seeing this now in COVID too. I mean, the health and welfare of their employees is the primary responsibility to that employee. And here you are trying to decide whether that employee's health and safety is going to take priority over violating the law or not. I think what we ought to do is put that out to our LinkedIn group over there and get some comments on that question, because I think it's a really good one, and it's something that, you know, we see, you know, quite often. I mean, I know that, for example, I remember when the Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl was kidnapped by the Taliban or ISIS. and they were holding him captive, and there are other folks who have been held captive in those countries as well, is what is a company to do when the law prohibits from paying those fees, but you want to get your guy back. You know him, you know his family, and it's just really tough. And there is an avenue for doing it, I suppose, by going through the federal government and looking for clearances for those type of payments. But it's a really tough dilemma.
Well, it really is, and it just makes the point that it's not uncommon to have a conflict between obeying the law and what's ethical. I mean, I think most, in that example I just gave, most people would say, well, the ethical thing is to save your employee's life. And I think everybody would agree with that. But unfortunately, the law did not make an exception for when the employee's life was in danger. So you're going to have to tune into one of Kevin's later episodes to find out how we resolved it. Bottom line is nobody went to jail and the executive was returned safely. That's all I'll tell you.
That is good news. That is really good news, because it doesn't always work out that way, as we know. And there's just a lot of executives, as I said earlier, that think they're doing good for the company, but they ended up, hurting their own career and ruining the company's reputation by taking these actions that they shouldn't be taking. So I think the bottom line on here that we need to be really focused in on is the importance of creating an ethical culture, getting everybody talking the same language as to what is ethical and what is not ethical. What are those compasses that people should be following, the moral compasses that people should be following, and how to maintain that march forward throughout the entire organization and get everybody up to speed and trained on a regular basis and thinking about these subjects rather than having their head, glued to their screens at home now. Because you can imagine maybe the peer pressure is different now that we're all working remote than what it was before, when people would have these conversations over the proverbial water cooler, and they're no longer be able to jump into somebody's office and talk about these different dilemmas. What do they do now? So Charles, what do you think as far as people working from home and working remotely, being able to maintain this ethical culture? What would be your recommendation out there?
Well, there's still the telephone. Every communication doesn't have to be made on Zoom, and you still can have a face-to-face meeting. You can still stay 6 feet apart and wear a mask and so forth. But if an in-person meeting is required, then you can do it. But I think overall, the situation with Zoom and other electronic media making the education that you provide, Kevin, so much more accessible, because you don't have to have 50 different executives from around the U.S. Come to New York City to sit in a conference room. They can have the same thing by getting on a Zoom call. Obviously, there's some trade-offs, but that's just where we are right now. I think at the end of the day, the benefit really is to the individual executive, because hopefully that person will come away with a feeling that I'm happy that the company I work for has an ethical culture. They're going to stand by me and stand behind me doing the right thing. I'm not going to get in trouble by talking to the compliance people or the lawyers or the ethics people. And I think that the greatest benefit of all, Kevin, what you do, which is a little bit different than how so many companies do compliance and ethics, normally just citing a bunch of rules. The way you do it is talking so much as you do about the psychology and the emotions and the individual impact. I think what the net effect is that there's a thought placed in every executive's in the back of their mind that when they're conducting business, whether meeting with a competitor or whatever it is, they've got the benefit of some of these ideas that, again, they don't have to be an expert, but you have sensitized them to the fact that, oh, this may be this may be something that I need to get some advice on. This may be something that could lead to some trouble if I don't get some advice. And that, I think, is the by far the biggest benefit of what you're doing now.
Well, thank you. And then again, I think that's not just true with the executives. I think all of us want to work for a company that is ethical, that we can be proud of. I have unwavering belief that everybody wants to do the right thing, just that not everybody knows what the right thing is. Maybe deep down, they can take a look and say, well, this one particular company practice, I believe is unethical, but I know everybody in my industry does it. I hear that quite a bit as well. Everybody's out there doing that. Well, that's never an excuse. It's never going to be an excuse. Doing the right thing. You shouldn't burden yourself what other people are doing. That has no impact on your own ethics, your own thoughts on it. Everything should be based on what is right. This is the values base that we're talking about, not what everybody else is doing. So you need to be able to have those moral compasses in place for all the employees. And I think everybody wants to do the right thing, and we just need to let them do the right thing going forward. And again, I think it's, again, getting everybody speaking the right language, getting everybody trained on what values-based ethics is all about, training the leadership in values-based ethics, as well as providing these weekly tidbits on keeping ethics on the top of their mind, so people are always mindful of it. Because if it's only once a year, then come 2 or 3 months, they're all going to forget about what this is all about. So we need to be able to keep it on top of people's mind. And those executives need to have a place to go to ask for advice. And I provide that service as well. And so they can jump on a phone, on a Zoom call with me and get feedback with myself and other executives. And that is available out there by subscribing to my ethics toolkit formula. And it's a complete package. It's a whole process that will resolve, the ethical culture solution, or go a long way to resolving the ethical culture solution for organizations. But I see, Charles, that we are about ready to wrap up here. We have just a couple minutes left. I want to thank you for coming into the studio today and being able to talk to you one-on-one on this, and bringing your insight. It's been very, very valuable, and I really appreciate your